Guess who's back? Back again. Back at the normal setup. Bang! Got a fresh cut too. Feeling good. Feeling right. Let's get into it. A pretty after dinner speech for $1 billion. When on the evening of December 12, 1900, some 80 of the nation's financial nobility gathered in a banquet hall of the University Club of Fifth Ave to do honor to a young man from out of the West. Now, half a dozen of the guests realized they were to witness the most significant episode in American industrial history. J. Edward Simpson and Charles Stewart Smith, their hearts full of gratitude for the lavish hospitality bestowed on them by Charles M. Schwab during a recent visit to Pittsburgh, had arranged the dinner to introduce the 80-year-old steel man to Eastern Banking Society, but they didn't expect him to stampede the convention. They warned him, in fact, that the Bosmans within New York's suited shirts would not be responsive to oratory, and that if he didn't want to bore the Stillmans and Harrismans and Vanderbilts, he had better limit himself to 15 or 20 minutes of polite vaporizing and let it go at that. Even John Pierpont Morgan, sitting on the right hand of Schwab, has become his imperial dignity, intended to grace the banquet table with his presence only briefly, and so far as the press and public were concerned, the whole affair was of so little moment that no mention of it found its way into print the next day. So the two hosts and their distinguished guests ate their way through the usual 7 or 8 courses. There was little conversation, and what there was of it was restrained. Few of the bankers and brokers had met Schwab, whose career had flowered along the banks of the Monongahela, and none knew him well. But before the event was over, they, and with them Money Master Morgan, went to swept off his suite, and $1 billion baby, United States Steel Corporation, was to be conceived. It is perhaps unfortunate for the sake of history that no record of Charles Schwab's speech at the dinner ever was made. He repeated some parts of it at a later date during a similar meeting of Chicago bankers. And still later, when the government brought suit to dissolve the Steel Trust, he gave his own version from the witness stand of the remarks that stimulated Morgan into a frenzy of financial activity. It is possible, however, that it was a homely speech, somewhat ungrammatical, for the necessities of language never bothered Schwab, full of epigrams and threaded with wit. But aside from that, it had a galvanic force and effect upon the 5 billions of estimated capital that was represented by the diners. After it was over and gathering was still under its spell, although Schwab had talked for 90 minutes, Morgan led the orator to a receded window where, dangling their legs from the high, uncomfortable seat, they talked for an hour more. The magic of the Schwab personality had been turned on full force, but was more important and lasting was the full-fledged, clear-cut program he laid down for the arrangement of steel. Many other men had tried to interest Morgan in slapping together a steel trust after the pattern of the biscuit, wire, and hoop, sugar, rubber, whiskey, oil, or chewing gum combinations. John W. Gates and Gambler had argued it, but Morgan distrusted him. The Moore boys, Bill and Jim, Chicago stock jobbers who had glued together a match trust and a cracker corporation, had argued it and failed. Albert H. Gary, the Santimus County lawyer, wanted to foster it, but he wasn't big enough to be impressive until Schwab's eloquency took J.P. Morgan to the heights from which he could visualize the solid results of the most daring financial undertaking ever conceived. The project was regarded as a delirious stream of easy money crackpots. The financial magnetism that began a generation ago to attract thousands of small and sometimes insufficient managed companies into large and competitive crashing combinations had become operative in the steel world through the devices of the jovial business pirate John H. Gates. Gates already had formed the American Steel and Wire Company out of a chain of small concerns, and together with Morgan had created the Federal Steel Company. The National Tube and American Bridge Companies were two more Morgan concerns, and the Moore brothers had forsaken the match and cookie business to form the American Group, tin plate, steel, hoop, sheet steel, and the National Steel Company. But by the side of Andrew Carnegie's gigantic vertical trust, a trust owned and operated by 53 partners, those other combinations were pecuniary. They might combine to their heart's content, but the whole lot of them couldn't take a dent in the Carnegie organization, and Morgan knew it. The eccentric old Scot knew it too. From the magnificent heights of Skibo Castle, he had viewed first with the amusement and then with resentment the attempts of Morgan's smaller companies to cut into its business. When the attempts became too bold, Carnegie's temper was translated into anger and retaliation. He decided to duplicate every mill owned by his rivals. Hitherto, he hadn't been interested in wire, pipes, hoops, or sheet. Instead, he was content to sell such companies the raw steel and let them work into whatever shape they wanted. Now, with Schwab as his chief and able lieutenant, he planned to drive his enemies to the wall. So it was that in the speech of Charles M. Schwab, Morgan saw the answer to his problems of combination. A trust without Carnegie, giant of them all, would be no trust at all. A plum pudding, as one writer said, without the plums. Schwab's speech on the night of December 12, 1900, undoubtedly carried the inference, though not the pledge, that the vast Carnegie enterprise should be brought under the Morgan tent. He talked of the world future for steel, of reorganization for efficiency, of specialization, of the scrapping of unsuccessful mills, and concentration of effort on the flourishing properties of economics in the one traffic of economies in overhead and administrative departments of capturing foreign markets. More than that, he told the buccaneers among them wherein lay the errors of their customary piracy. Their purposes, he inferred, had been to create monopolies, raise prices, and pay themselves fat dividends out of privilege. Schwab condemned the system in his hardest manner. The short-sightedness of such a policy, he told his hearers, lay in the fact that it had restricted the market in an era where when everything cried for expansion. By cheapening the cost of steel, he argued, an ever-expanding market would be created, more uses for steel would be deceived, and a goodly portion of the world trade would be captured. Actually, though he did not know it, Schwab was an absolute of modern mass production. So the dinner at the University Club came to an end. Morgan went home to think about Schwab's rosy predictions. Schwab went back to Pittsburgh to run the steel business for Andrew Carnegie, while Gary and the rest went back to their stock tickers. to fiddle around in anticipation of the next move. It was not long coming. It took Morgan about 1 week to digest the feast of reason Schwab had placed before him. When he had asserted himself that no financial indigestion was to result, he sent for Schwab and found the young man rather coy. Mr. Carnegie, Schwab indicated, might not like if he found his trust company president had been flirting with the Emperor of Wall Street. The street upon which Carnegie was resolved never to tread. Then it was suggested by John W. Gates, the go between, that if Schwab happened to be in the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia, J.P. Morgan might also happen to be there. When Schwab arrived, however, Morgan was inconveniently ill at his New York home, and so on the elder man's pressing invitation, Schwab went to New York and presented himself at the door of the financiers' library. I'm gonna take a pause there. Obviously the story is going to continue on, but pretty cool. I mean, not really much to say other than the fact that, you know, some plot is kind of going on and it will continue on, but that will be part of the next episode. I mean, the next video. But yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow. How about that, huh? Bang.